So many years ago, I looked at a technique called long polling, which is a technique in which you hold open a request to the server and then stream data over that persistent connection back to the browser. In the years since I've looked at that, a new object has been added to the DOM called EventSource, which essentially takes all of that long polling logic and bakes it into native code in the browser. So I want to take a look at how that might work in a ColdFusion application. Now, if we jump over into our network activity here, you'll see that I have a messages.cfm HTTP request that's being held open. And this is going to be our server sent events pathway. Now, when we have that held open, I can send messages from this frame source to the ColdFusion server, which will more or less become immediately available in this frame source, which is using the long polling server sent events technique. So let's say hello, and you can see immediately that showed up. We can see the event showing up here. How are you? Those are immediately becoming available. If we look at the network activity, this doesn't always work, but sometimes, let's filter on messages. Here we can even see the event stream in the network activity, and this is the data that's coming down over the wire from the ColdFusion server. You can see those individual messages are showing up as individual events as streamed over that persistent HTTP request. Now, the request, in my case, times out after about 20 seconds, which is what these source errors are. But then what you'll see immediately in the network activity is that once one message's request ends, another one is then more or less opened within a couple of seconds. So let's take a look at how this works on the ColdFusion side. If we look at our application CFC, all I'm doing is creating an instance of linked blocked queue, and I'm storing that as the message queue in the application scope. You can think of this as just a fancy array that has a poll method, which allows me to block and wait until items on this array become available. Now, sending the message in our top frame here, let's take a look at that. That's super simple. All it is a form that has a message input and a traditional server-side post back. So I'm going to post back to the server. If a message is available, I'm just going to push it onto that message queue. And you see I'm going to create a unique ID for the message. The text is the message itself, and then that's going onto the queue. Now, before we look at the JavaScript code that does the actual long polling, let's go ahead and take a look at the messages CFM, our API endpoint for this server sent events. The server sent events are going to read from this message queue, and they're going to stream messages back to the client. So let's take a look at that. The server sent event protocol requires that the content type of the response be text event stream. If you don't do this, it's simply going to ignore any data that you send over it. Now, there are other details required for this protocol. One is that there has to be a data line sent, and that's going to contain the body of the message. In this case, I'm sending over a JSON payload, but there's nothing specific to this that requires JSON. That's just what most of us are used to using. Now, we can also send over an event : and an ID : line, and I say line because these are all delimited with a new line character. If we don't include an event line, the EventSource object on the client side will by default use an event type of message, but we can use a custom message type. In this case, I'm going to use CFL message, and you'll see in a minute on the client side, that's the type that we bind to. Now, there's nothing natively about text event stream that will hold this request open. We have to do that purposefully in our ColdFusion code. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to pick a point in the future. So I'm going to pick 25 seconds into the future. And then I'm just going to loop while it's less than that cutoff point. So essentially, I'm going to stick in that while loop for the next 25 seconds. But you'll notice that I don't have any sleep commands here. And typically you would want a sleep command so you don't overwhelm the CPU. Instead, I'm leaning on that .poll method in that linked block queue that I mentioned earlier. Poll will sit and wait for a particular timeout, waiting for an item until it either gets it or it returns null, which is why if it returns null, I'm just going to continue on to the next loop of my while loop. So I get that message, and then I serialize it and send it back, and then I flush the response to the client. Messages are delimited by an additional new line. Technically, they're delimited by 2 new lines in a row, but if we end everything with a new line, then all we have to do is add an additional new line to say this is the end of the message. Okay, so now let's jump over into the client-side code where we can see how all this data is being consumed. And that's in our read CFM. The new object, or I say new, but I think it's like 10 years old at this point, but the long polling native functionality in the browser is now supported by this EventSource object. We can give it an API endpoint. In this case, I'm giving it that ColdFusion endpoint. It takes some additional options, but those don't pertain to our particular demo. And then once we have our instance of EventStream, you can see that we can attach event listeners to it. I'm going to be listening to the CFML message, which is the custom message type we actually define in our payload here. So I'm going to listen to that, hand it off to handle message. That's going to parse that JSON payload that we received. And then I'm just going to duplicate this template and merge it into this UL, which is what we're seeing here in our bulleted list. Now you'll see that there's no logic in here for the reconnecting or the maintaining of the connection or anything of the low-level nature. And that's why this is a much cleaner long polling approach when compared to how we would do it with Ajax or jQuery back in the day. All of that complexity is basically hidden away from us. We just create the event source, we point it at our API, and it takes care of actually managing the HTTP request and then emitting events when we need to respond to them. So it's pretty cool. I don't think I would necessarily use it much. I'm a huge fan of WebSockets and using Pusher, for example, to push data from the server to the client. However, I can definitely see this being very useful in a simple proof of concept or a prototype where you just want to prove the value of a particular workflow, but you don't necessarily want to have all the infrastructure and or cost if you're using a third-party vendor for something like WebSockets. So this has been around for quite a long time, but this is the first time I'm looking at it. So hopefully there's something in here that's of interest to someone.